we want to talk about the senior chief Njega wa Gioko and the European missionaries in the colonial Kenya. You can see him on the screen. Senior Chief Njega wa Gioko is arguably one of the characters history has always wanted to forget. But he is a man with a unique history in Kenya, and we dare not forget our history. Otherwise, we may repeat some errors, and the future generation may tend to make the mistake of ignoring the errors and fail. So we are looking at Senior Chief Njega wa Gioko and the European missionaries in the colonial Kenya in order to help ourselves understand the future. Now, I want to begin by saying, as part of my introduction, that the 19th and 20th century European missionaries found Njega wa Gioko, who was born in 1865 and died in 1948, and Goto wa Kibeto, who was born in 1860 and died in 1927, in the present day Kirinyaga County of Central Kenya, as the Roko Athamaki, that is plural for Muthamaki, meaning revered elder or revered leaders of the community. By then, we didn't have chiefs or kings in the community. There was only Athamaki and other types of leaders who are not necessarily translatable to chiefs and kings that we hear in the Western concepts. With the Athamaki being the custodians of critical matters, especially on land-related concerns, they had to liaise. The missionaries had to liaise with them in order to find places for settling their respective missionary enterprises. So they had to deal with the Athamaki, or the communal leaders, or the revered elder of the communities that they found. And because these were the custodians of the religio-cultural systems of the people, Now, these European missionaries, particularly the Protestant wing, were overly dismissive of African cultural lifestyles, which they felt was irredeemably ungodly, secular, and fetish. They further dismissed African religiosity or heritage as ancestral worship, and its practitioners were dismissed as fetish worshippers. They also viewed the African god as what we call in Latin as Deus Otiotus, or idol gods, or Deus Remotus, meaning withdrawn gods. They could also dismiss the African religious discourses as pagan, dualistic, pantheistic, animistic, idolatry, heathenism, primitivism, and later they could refer to them as polytheism. Some other times they started calling them syncretic, jargons of the West, syncretism, rather than, especially when dialogue between Christianity and then goes and the cultures of the people came in, they simply dismissed the dialogue that came as syncretic rather than enculturation or other friendly jargons. Nevertheless, this was nothing but the game of lexical semantics and divergent perspectives, as the indigenous people were paradoxically notorious and all reputable in their religiosity and spirituality. Interestingly, the society which was viewed as animistic or deus remotus had a very strong belief in Gai, or God, who was well manifested throughout creation. You remember Psalmist 24 saying, the earth is the Lord's and all there is in it. That was also the true possession, as the psalmist would say of God. The local people in Njega Gioko's jurisdiction were seeing everything as a blessing from God. That doesn't make them pantheistic, as they were called later on, as the concept of God among the Africans came now to be felt later. But they reverned areas, some areas where they felt God was blessing everything. So Ngai or Murungu was believed to be the source of all created things, visible or invisible. Hence, the reason for another name for God is Mumbi, meaning Munda or creator. The missionaries who entered Njega Gioko's chiefdom, as it later came to be a chiefdom, once he was pronounced as a chief in 1908, also found environmental preservers who classified trees in different categories as a measure of demonstrating their respective importance. That is, for example, building trees such as Mukoigo, or in botanical name Brideria micrantha. Medicinal trees such as the same Mukoigo again, Brideria micrantha. Muiri, also a medicinal tree. Prunus africana in botanical name. There were also trees that were classified as poisonous trees, such as Rosago, also called Mysopis emini in botanical names, and whose dust from Musago, who used to be called rockery, Muguruka, it would make people bride. And so people were taught, even children were taught, how to deal with the trees and to preserve the environment as it belongs to God. Trees that mark the boundaries were also categorized, and they included Mu or Mankaima rutea in botanical names. There is also Muigoya. There is also Muigoya tree, or in botanical name Precratranthus barbatus. There is also another one for demarcating boundaries, another tree they called Caliaria. That is Euphorbia in botanical name Euphorbia tilucali, also called finger euphorbia in those botanical names. There is also Musimoro or Rantana camara, and so on and so forth. There were also trees that provided detergents for washing clothes. That is more again, which is Mankaima rutea in botanical names. And others were sacred trees referred to Mugumo or Ficus dhoningii. There is also Mururi or Trichilia emetica, vow, and so on. Now, in Njega Gioko's jurisdiction or area, some trees were regarded as sources of material culture, and one was around to use small trees on the fringes of the forest for purposes of making material culture items such as farming sticks or miro. There are also crabs, jogoma, crabs. You can use it even to fight some disturbing animals or something, those crabs. There is also walking sticks, particularly for the elderly, locally called mukwanjo among the locals. Those walking sticks could be made from the fringes of the forest, not the interior of the forest, because the forest could not be interfered with. It is a sacred place. The forest belongs to God, and there were a lot of sayings and proverbs to discourage anyone from desecrating forests, and even rivers and other places. Hence, the environmental preservation among the indigenous African people within this great man, Njega wa Gioko's area, was taken care of. So you could make use of the forests, the Kirinyaga forest around it, or those bushy forested areas which were all over, provided no human-made tools were used in the process. However, under no circumstances could one use wood from the sacred trees for house building. Of course, the missionaries could not understand whether these things were real, or the African people were capable of preserving the environment. They thought these people couldn't. They were not capable of doing something decent. They wanted to change the whole system of an African person. But we cannot blame them, because those are the kind of stereotypical upbringing that they came with. The stories they had heard from the writings of anthropologists such as Edward B. Taylor, were so unfair to the African people. The literature propounded was so bad. It was so misleading. It could mislead a king, a queen, an ordinary person, anybody, a missionary. Anyone could be misled by the kind of literature about the African people who are equated with apes, monkeys, and other animals that appeared a bit intelligent in the forest. So it was so sad. Now, in their holistic spirituality and religiosity, rather, that permitted all pillars of culture. You can refer to kinship, ethics, politics, economics, aesthetics, ethics. Everyone, every person played his or her role in service to God and creation. That is, Adamaki and other reading elders were not working for themselves, but for God and humanity and all community. So there's nothing capitalistic, there's nothing individualistic. It was for society. Even children upbringing was for community. And it's more or less, children did not have specific people to take care of. Everybody was religiously and spiritually inclined to take care of a younger person, and devise sometimes discipline, including some little caning, not really caning, but some little discipline to show the way. And nobody could complain that you are interfering. Nobody could take you to court, because everybody was trained to do things responsibly out of religious duty, as a religious duty rather. And all departments of life were driven by the theo-religious motive, as honoring good and selfless people got promoted up to the office of an ancestral spirit upon death. So not everybody became an ancestor, so that we don't build a cult of death, as everyone who died in Africa became automatic ancestor. No, ancestors were believed to be the mediators between people and God. So not everybody became an ancestor, but those who led exemplary lives, for those who are hospitable to the widows, those who are hospitable to children without parents, those who are responsible to the very poor of the poorest, those who are responsible for strangers passing through your land. You give them water, a drink, give them food, you give them necessity, you show them the way if they lost their way towards their other destinations. Those were people who are candidates of becoming ancestors. And in actual fact, the ancestors were more like divinities of sorts, because they could come to everyone when you are dreaming, when you are walking. They could counsel people, they could talk to people, they could solve conflict. Of course, there were also evil spirits. As people believed there were evil spirits, that could cause even disagreement, quarrels, and other malpractices, and even misfortunes like lack of rain, famine. There are all those beliefs there in the Njega Gioko's territory. And hence, they were mediators. The ancestors were mediators between the living and the dead. To this end, an emphasis on realized eschatology. Eschatology is a study of end times. So when we talk about realized eschatology, we talk about the present concern, as opposed to unrealized eschatology, where we talk about what will come. Particularly the missionaries came up with a huge emphasis on what will come. The heaven will go, and people are told, forget about realized eschatology, that you are pleasing God by the present behaviors, by works, by the activities you do to one another, but focus on the one to come, the day of the Lord. That is the unrealized eschatology. So what I was saying is, to this end, an emphasis on realized eschatology or present concerns in the pre-missionary era was the key to godliness in the African spirituality that was ironically dismissed as not there at all. To be hospitable to the immediate community, to the strangers, to the less privileged, such as widows, orphans, displaced, victims of misfortunes, and the hungry among others, was clearly seen as a climax of African spirituality. Now, the first European explorers, missionaries, and settler farmers were initially welcomed in Njega Gioko's locality, that is the present-day Kirinyaga County of Kenya. Out of this African spirituality, which expresses itself in Ubuntu, or humanness, or umundu, or in Swahili utu, humanness, Ubuntu, or umundu, or utu, humanness, that seeing human beings should be preserved, should be given hospitality, should be given support where they are strangers, where they are wandering, they should be shown the way. So when these settlers, farmers, missionaries, or European explorers began coming in, as we shall see in this presentation, the general feeling was, take care of these people, till they started abusing this African hospitality, and people had to fight back. As we shall see, Njega Gioko becomes a hero when he fought in hospitable, he stopped in hospitable European caravan that was crossing over from the neighboring Biri, later renamed Foto, and in 1963 renamed Murang'a district, and now Murang'a County. When he stopped them from crossing River Sagana, or the biggest river in Kenya, called River Tana, in 1901 with his warriors, that's the time they gave him the name Mudhamaki, the title of a Mudhamaki. So he became Mudhamaki Njega Gioko. Before then, he was simply son of Gioko, Maingi, son of Mzee Gioko. But now he becomes a Mudhamaki. Of course, there are other things we shall consider that made Njega Gioko a Mudhamaki, and not just an ordinary villager or man of the village. So, as we shall see thus in this presentation, Mudhamaki Njega Gioko finally employed the same African spirituality in allocating this European land at the hill, particularly the missionaries, the Anglican missionaries at the hill of Mutira, which he called Gasomberera Kamutira or Kalema Kamutira or Jombe Mutira in 1908. Now, despite this generosity, he demonstrated his dispensation of hospitality with prudence when he made it clear to both Anglican missions, the Church Missionary Society, or abbreviated CMS, and the Consolata missionaries, that is the Roman Catholics, that land had to be purchased since it was not to be offered free or freely. So he told them, when you reach there, that's the spots I'm sending you to, you find elders there, the local elders know who to say to buy the land from and pay according to what they'll tell you. It doesn't matter whether it will be in form of rupees. Now Indian money had come by then to the country, rupees, the Indian rupees, or it will be in form of cattle. Do what they tell you. But by then, by 1908, when this deal was sealed, by 1907, when they started coming in Kithugoya near Sagana, money had already started coming in. It was colonial system had already entered. So, in other words, when the Roman Catholic missionaries asked for land to settle their mission station, as they opened up a center, Gioko accepted, as in the case of the Anglicans noted earlier, and allowed them to purchase the land in the then bushy and fearful Kiriguoya area, as Kiriguoya was then called. In turn, Kiriguoya means the fearful place, as the forested area was full of tough wild animals and fearful beliefs that the area had been infested with evil spirits. That was actually the common talk in before 1906 or thereabout, or before 1907. Clearly, Kerugoya town, which is orally said to have been a fearful forest with tall trees and beasts before 1904, 1906, when Europeans started settling in the area, now called Embu and Kirinyaga counties. By then, people were just called by different names, not as it is today. Hence, the name comes from the prefix kere, which means the one with, and suffix guoya, which means the fearful. Kireguoya therefore meant the fearful place with spirits, fearful spirits, and wild or tough animals that were attacking people. Thus, Kireguoya was corrupted from Kireguoya, meaning the fearful place, and the name, the present name stands as Kireguoya. Apart from hospitality as an expression of African indigenous spirituality, the European missionaries who were settling in Gioko's domain in 1907 to 1908, after Colonel Richard Menzagen's conquest from 1902 to 1905, found a people who had their own form of medicine administration and medicine practitioners who were well known in the society and were doing well, very well in medicine, even dealing with the metaphysics. Such were easily dismissed by European missionaries, the Calvinistic missionaries or evangelical missionaries, as witches, sorcerers, and such related dismissive phrases. Particularly, as I've noted, the Protestant wing, not the Catholic. Catholics were a bit slow in condemnation. But the Protestant wing that claimed to be evangelical Christians was overly dismissive and had no room for anything African heritage. Now, indigenous practices or indigenous medicine practitioners the so-called Andu-Ago, or singular, is Mundumogo. One person is Mundumogo, but when they are many, we would call them Andu-Ago. That is people who practice medicine, because the practice of medicine went beyond the current form of medicine, because today a medicine man may just give the may inject or give somebody with medicine, or give capsules to gulp or something, but or take you through a microscope or other gadgets. But then the indigenous medicine practitioners were a bit different, because they would also they were also, in a sense, diviners, or could foretell. They could tackle metaphysical things, including beliefs. They were also counselors in one way or the other. They had other jobs besides giving medicine. They also tackled metaphysical, both physical and metaphysical things. Metaphysical referring to things you can't touch, like beliefs, weed, fears. That is metaphysical, beyond touch, metaphysical, as opposed to the physical things like giving doses, physical doses. So the indigenous medicine practitioners in Njega Gioko's area could handle all these things. So like Adamaki, they were equally a powerful, and all revered people in the locality. At times, they were consulted about the future, for healing, and even for exorcising ill omens. And this is an area the missionaries could not do: exorcising demons, exorcising ill omens, foretelling. Some of these things did not come out clearly, even if some claim to have prophetic powers among the missionaries themselves. But the African medicine men could go beyond the the Western doctors in that sense. Hence, people could still find themselves, even after Westernization came, going to the ancestral, appealing to ancestral pantheons, or appealing to ancestral oracles as a situation demands. Even as we shall see, even today, we still have pockets of it. Even in the 21st century, the globalized Africa, the globalized former Njega Gioko's territory, such things are also visible. Now, the evil spirits at Kirigoya, now Kirigoya town, could be exorcised from time to time by some of these medicine men and diviners. While some diviners and medicine men rarely practiced, which was rarely practiced by women, formally and publicly, save at domestic level, where prenatal and antenatal care was for women, was under women, got it through inheritance. So I'm saying men who became diviners and medicine men, which was more or less the same office, would get it through inheritance. Sometimes others could get it by divine calling. Others could get it through African informal, what we would call African informal education, where people were taught how to mix certain concoctions, to use certain trees that were medicinal and use it appropriately, and people were there. So the Western society did not find an empty tabula rasa, an empty space. There were people who were able to reach there through the African medicine. So they could use divination objects, common sense, and also express their own insights. Characteristically, the diviners, the seers, they are the maki, or the ideal reading elders, and fortune tellers, among other specialists, played priestly roles in diverse ways. It is no wonder that diviners are still consulted in Christian Africa right into the 21st century, especially in times of crisis, in times of coronavirus disease of 2019. Now it is 2020 and even 2021. That is COVID-19. Participant observation has showed that the role of African medicine men has become a critical area that is being consulted in the era of in the area that Njega Gioko superintended. This is clearly seen as African Christians make concoctions that seek to treat COVID-19. Clearly, the use of Njega, a natural antioxidant, lemon and honey as dawa or medicine, has gained a momentum in this area where Gioko superintended, just as in the rest of Kenya, and is seen as one which provides COVID-19 healing properties, among other creative ways that are rooted in African indigenous society. Njega is seen as critical in boosting people's health as it protects against colorectal cancer. Lemon is, on the other hand, seen as rich in vitamin C and critically important for detoxing. Other humble methods of treating COVID-19 in Chief Njega Gioko's former jurisdiction include steam therapy or steam inhalation to fight respiratory tract infections, the use of hot steam mystery wafts from a pan, use of culinary herbs and neem trees, among other medicinal plants. As for the case of Madagascar, we learned that a tea containing traditional Malagasy plants, including Artemisia, has been used in attempting to contain COVID-19 and other related ailments. Although these indigenous medicinal practices, rooted in African religiosity and spirituality, have largely failed to gain traction globally, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 80% of Africans, including in the area where Gioko was leading, rely on traditional medicine for their health care needs. And although the Protestant missionaries had already reached the present-day Kirinyaga, or Kenya, not Kirinyaga, as Kenya, in as early as 1844, when the Reverend Dr. Rudincraft arrived at Rabai in the coastal city of Mombasa, only in around mid-1907 did the Withaga Fort Hall CMS missionaries under other Wallace McGregor reached Gioko's jurisdiction. It is in 1908 when he recommended sites for missionary settlements in areas that were not well developed, in quotes. Was he taking the ones of regional seer Mugo, also called Shege wa Kibiru, from the neighboring Kaliara Muranga near Thika town, who had predicted the coming of the Caucasians, whom he described as pale strangers with skin complexion that would resemble pale currant frog, that is kiengere, that lives in water, prior to his death in early 1800s, and cautioned against bringing them too close to the locals, was Njega wa Gioko in pushing the missionaries far from the area that was more developed, Kiamudhambi then, and that other area of Githugoya Sagana, where they really wanted to start a mission station as early as 1907. Was he actually trying to pay heed to what Shege wa Kibiru had told them a few years before the missionaries started coming in Kenya in 1844, because Shege was there slightly before, in very early 1800. That's when he died, and had warned them that there are these Caucasians who may come. Of course, he never called them Caucasians. He would describe them as people appearing like butterflies. Shortly after Shege wa Gioko, Shege wa Kibiru, or Mogo wa Kibiru, he has two names. Shortly after his death, the Protestant missionaries began to enter the current Kenya's territorial space, as I've noted. when craft now comes. All was Njega wa Kebiru, the seer, reminiscing the first missionaries to settle on the East African coast. That is the Portuguese Roman Catholics, who had by 1557 established monasteries at Ramu and Mombasa, a distance of over 600 kilometers from his Kaliara Muranga Thika base. Nevertheless, it is critical to underline the 9 Protestant missionary societies that ushered in evangelical Christian theology that was too rigid and dogmatic. Unlike the Roman Catholics in Gioko, Central Kenya, as I've noted, these evangelical Protestant societies propounded a very rigid and all bright theological trajectory that had no room for dialogue with the local people whom they were going to evangelize. And they included the Gospel Missionary Society, GMS, German Lutheran Mission, GLM, Friends Africa Mission, FAM, Seventh-day Adventist, SDA, Church Missionary Society, CMS, Church of Scotland Mission, CSM, later Presbyterian, United Methodist Mission, UMM, and African Inland Mission, abbreviated AIM. Now, their dogmatic theological positions were the reason for the formation of African instituted churches in the region, because when African found people who are too tough on anything cultural, no use of drum in the church, no clapping of hands, no dance in the church, all these are satanic, anything African cultural, no noise, and they controls the noise. And African people being a noisy community, these people could find Satanism in that noisiness in their cultural behaviors. And that is the time when people started saying, let us form our own churches. That will not stop us from practicing some elements of culture that are too dear to us, yet we are being told they are satanic, they are evil. Let us try to start our own. And that brought about the birth of African Orthodox Church, the birth of Kalinga churches, there are quite a number, the Akolino churches, the African Independent Pentecostal Church of Africa, AIPCA, and many others that came up because of the rigidness of these Calvinistic and evangelical rigid Protestants who were more assertive than the Catholics. Now, let us now talk about Njega wa Gioko, the man. And I should hasten to say, perhaps it is important to ask who was Njega wa Gioko. His initial name was Mainge wa Gioko, born 1865 and died 1948. That is July 1948, the code July. He was renamed Njega, meaning the good one, wa Gioko, the good one wa Gioko, or Njega wa Gioko, and was elevated as a Mudhamaki, or leading elder, in his area in 1901 after several heroic strides. First, he was a great swimmer who saved several people from being swept away by the erratic flooding rivers, Rodho, Ruamudhambi, and even the mighty River Sagana or Tana River, which is cuts in some areas within Njega's territory. The latter is the longest and the largest river in Kenya. That is River Tana or Sagana in some areas. It is called Sagana River. In other areas, it's called Tana. And it covers 1,000 kilometers from its headwaters in the Aberdare Range at Mount Kenya to the Indian Ocean. As noted in Britannica, the river is only navigable by small craft for poultry 240 kilometers out of the 1,000 kilometers that it covers, meaning that its roughness made any swimmer who saved drowning souls to be hailed as heroic. The locals were thus pleased with Mainge wa Gioko's strides, as they saw Ngai's omnipresence in his superhuman efforts. Hence, he became a Muthamaki in 1901. He was actually made by the community. And of course, songs were always composed to heroize the legend that was coming, the young legend that was coming up in 1901, before 1901. By 1901, the community or the people around him were seeing his ontological significance, the importance of his being, his life, by the great things that we consider as he or had already demonstrated. As the colonial authorities looked for the local reading Africans who could be promoted as chiefs using the Western standards, Muthamaki Njega wa Gioko was an undisputed choice in Kirinyaga West of central Kenya, particularly the so-called Andia peoples of the present-day Kirinyaga County. His fame had gone and spread like bushfire. There's one man God was using in a mighty way, in a great way. And so that was the automatic person to be proposed as the chief, hence the pioneer chief, the colonial chief. Another heroic act that led to the reverence of Maingi wa Gioko into a Muthamaki Njega wa Gioko was his triumphant stopping of John Boy's team, a European by name John Boy's team, who was attempting to cross over from Biri, now Murang'a County, to the present-day Kirinyaga County in mid-1901. Without superior arms, Maingi wa Gioko was able to successfully engage Boy's team and repulsed them. Hence, they did not enter his jurisdiction at that time, maybe much later. In turn, John Boyes was a youthful European imperialist who had settled in the neighboring Murang'a town, then called Biri Settlement, in as early as 1898. Due to his love for the turtle beans, the locals nicknamed him Kalianjahi, the one who likes to eat turtle beans. He subtly or cunningly made the locals in the neighboring Murang'a to think he was ritualistically initiated in their religious culture when he married 4 local Kikuyu women, thereby becoming the first known European polygamist in Kenya's historiography. Apart from this pro-African gesture, where polygamy was broadly accepted to bring the surplus women who were always in surplus by the society, Kalianjai therefore was appreciated for pro-African gesture, though there were issues that people had concerns with. Kalianjai also learned their local language. That was also another pro-African gesture. Of course, John Paul II used to say, the Pope, the Catholic Pope used to say, teach Latin, but it is important to know the youth. Teach youth the Latin, but it is important to know the youth themselves. So Kalianjai kind of trying to create an impression he understood the people by knowing the language. And you know language is the vehicle of communication, is the vehicle of culture. It carries culture across. So he also learned their local language, the Kikuyu of Murang'a. He also shot wild animals which were common for them as food and such other gimmicks that brought him closer to the locals. Initially, John Boyes or Kalianjai was seen in the rig of roaming European adventurers. Initially was seen as a roaming person, European. There was a lot of roaming Europeans and who was interested in ivory trade and who could at times set the locals against one another. Sometimes Kalianjai would set locals against one another, fighting one another, sometimes provide fighting arms in order to get ivory. Okay? That's how some of these adventurers began, who are marauding around the so-called central Kenya, particularly neighboring Njega wa Gioko's chiefdom. John Boyes, who was born in 1875 and died in 1951, then made a weird claim, that he had bought the local Mount Kirinyaga, Mount Kenya, today is Mount Kenya, after he gave, or rather it was corrupted Mount Kenya. It is supposed to be Mount Kirinyaga, the mountain of God, after he gave out 10 cows to Chief Wangombe Wahira, and self-proclaimed chief, though he was not a chief, was more of another Shaka the Zulu, black imperialist who wanted to conquer people and rule. He used to work with 500 Masai Morans because he knew 2 languages, the Kikuyu and the Masai, because his mother was a Masai and his father was a Kikuyu from Nyeri. So Chief Wangombe was given on our behalf, on people's behalf, 10 cows, and because he was claiming to be the leader, but actually he was self-styled. He was actually a fugitive from Teto, ran to Madeira and then to Muranga. He kept moving away whenever he was discovered that he had weird and some unbecoming behavior. And he had a mercenary team. He also gave 10 cows. Boyes also gave 10 cows to Chief Oromondo of Dorobo ethnic group, that is the hunters, as both the Dorobo and the Kikuyu live together, where we have Muranga town today, and other places, because initially they were pastoralists, or they were wandering group, the hunting people, where they were always found everywhere in the areas that we talk today, as mainly as Kiambu, Muranga, and other areas. Now, the buying of the mountain of God, or the purchasing of the mountain of God, the sacred square, where the smoke of sacrificial animals was believed to go, especially as rainmakers, the Daga prayed for rain, was a big insult to the local spirituality, as the mountain of God could not be bought by anyone. It could not be sold. To some, it was a mockery of the African indigenous religion. It was an insult for somebody to claim he has bought the mountain of God, which symbolizes the deep spirituality of the people. To a large extent, this was an open declaration of war with the Gikoyon God, or the local God, including the Kirinyaga people, as a sacred mountain of Gai, on God, could not be advertised and bidders invited for sale. In his book, which he wrote, this gentleman, King of the Wakikuyu, a true story of travel and adventure in Africa, Boyes, published in 1912. Boyes, in page 10, is unapologetic for declaring himself the first Kikuyu king. The first Kikuyu king in a community that did not have kings, a community that did not sell mountains or certain sacred places. He declares himself the first king of a Kikuyu. Of course, I would say I've never heard of another Kikuyu king, or a Kirinyaga king. I've never heard of a Kirinyaga king, or a Kikuyu king, or a king within the counties occupied by the people in Mount Kenya region, the Malians, the Empians, the Berians. Never. In a non-centralized society that had no kings or chiefs, John Boyes trying to usher in a new leadership trajectory, as even the other Maki, the elevated elders, did not install themselves. The community looked at their ontological significance for quite some times and made the deserving ones other Maki, or the leading elders. Equally, Boyes attempted to trick them to feel like he was truly a member of the local community when he created a warrior army of 5,000 uniformed Biri Kikuyu men in 1899. In all these discourses, we can easily view it as a conflict between the indigenous religiosity and the Western theosocial perspectives. In an African society which is 100% Ubuntu, or humane, or caring, or hospitable, and indeed are very hospitable, to strangers and wanderers, as in the case of Mohoi, meaning beggar, or Mudhoni, meaning in-law, who are given limited cultivation and building rights, though they cannot own land. Why did Maingi wa Gioko assemble his warriors to stop them in 1901? Why did he fight these strangers? Yet African people don't fight strangers. They actually get hospitable to strangers. You give them drink, food, and then ask them, where are you going? How can I help you? First, be hospitable with food and drink, particularly porridge. Okay? Further, in a community that sees strangers as returning ancestors, where did Wagioko praise the community, the communal hospitality? And did it happen that he was hailed? And how did it happen that he was hailed and or eulogized for being inhospitable to strangers? How did it happen that he was heroized and elevated and praised for fighting people, yet the African people are notoriously hospitable? But as early as the late 1700s, the stories of brutal incoming Europeans with their magic sticks, you can talk of guns, had been told and retold in central Kenya region. In particular, stories concerning Arab slave traders were equally doing rounds and all had been experienced in some parts of Mount Kenya region, even though little capture of slaves had been experienced in Wagioko's locality, as was the case with the present-day Embu, Tharaka Nithi, Meru, and Embu counties. Additionally, the neighboring Biri, renamed Muranga area, where Boyes had set up his camp, and by 1888 experienced the so-called Ngaraguya Ruraya, that is, the European-triggered famine that had reduced the people into scavengers and skeletons who ate anything palatable, including banana tree stumps, sienjashia marigo, which means sienjashia marigo, that is, banana tree stumps. Some would try to eat it, yet it is not palatable, it's not eatable, and hence, among other things, in a desperate attempt to stay alive. It was renamed the European famine. The 1898 famine was renamed Ngaraguya Ruraya, or European famine, due to the way in which the incoming Europeans to central Kenya had disrupted food preservation through granaries and farming activities. Although Boroliwandea, or the land with lots of food, or the present-day Kirinyaga, of course it was not initially in Dia, but in Dea, meaning eating country, Boroliwandea, was not badly affected by the European famine, as was the case with their neighbors. The society had developed fears of such encounters, even though even though it didn't experience in totality the European famine, because there were less European wanderers around Njega's area. After all, he had even stopped them by 1901. And the Arabs were not also reaching that area. They would come through the Arab slave traders. They would pass through Kambarand, pass through Bere, then Embu, then Meru, but not exactly. The route within Njega Gioko's fiefdom was not explicit for Arab slave traders who would capture people. Hence, but the story had been heard of people with evil spirits coming from who are brown in complexion. Hence, when Maingi wa Gioko sought to stop the strangers from crossing over River Sagana and enter his area, it was like trying to ward off evil spirits and or attempting to stop it from messing up the people. In other words, hospitality as a spiritual concept in African indigenous society was prudently administered. Hence, bride hospitality was not the norm, nor was somebody encouraged to keep off destructive strangers who are to do harm to the people. In any case, fears of returning evil spirits could come through harmful strangers also. Another heroic act that led to the reverence of Maingi wa Gioko into a Mudhamaki Njega wa Gioko, was his triumphant act of saving frogs from being mauled by fierce animals. Prior to 1901, Mange wa Gioko had also played a critical role in saving a woman and child from some Europeans who had captured them upon coming to Biri in the neighboring Muranga. Hence his youthfulness that took place as European settlers began to enter central Kenya in 1898 and 1899 was experientially informed by bad neighborliness, especially among incoming strangers. Having experienced the Arab slave traders who had reportedly captured dozens of people in the neighboring villages, and after encountering the incoming European settlers, Njega had to prepare to pursue peace and make peace at whatever costs. The coming of the evangelical European missionary later, that's 1907 to 1912, did not change his suspicious position. He remained suspicious till 1947, as we shall see, when he kind of started embracing westernization in a very careful way by even allowing people for the first time in 1947 to go to school. These other ones who went to school went there on their own volition or through other Africans who are more or less careful not to be seen to be competing with the Mudhamaki, but still encouraging people to go to school, especially where in areas far from where Njega's station was. Shortly after the 1901 Boyes Wagioko's warrior contest, you can remember John Boyes and Njega Wagioko warriors, they are two warriors contest along River Sagana, a more brutal conquest, was experienced as a sadistic and ruthless British imperialist, Colonel Richard Menzagen, born 1878 and died in 1967, took the area by storm. Prior to this punitive attack of 1902 to 1904, Maynard Zagen had just replaced Francis Hall, the pioneer European administrator in the present-day Muranga County, who died in 1801, some months after settling there. As Colonel Menzagen moved from the present-day Muranga County through Njega Wagioko's area and towards the present-day Embu County headquarters to the east, and where he finally established a fort in 1804 after protracted war with the Rock warriors, Menzagen committed atrocities that are hard to record accurately, save for the doctored figures that he personally released in his memo or in his book that he published in 1957, very late, in late days. Seen as the Christians conquering the African indigenous religion by force rather than by proselytizing, these attacks further created a huge mistrust between the westernization and Christianity that nearly made Wagioko to perennially fail to see anything good in it till 1947, when he reluctantly threw in the towel. Now, during this 1902-1904 expedition, Colonel Menatsagen, this European conqueror, had also hired the services of over 500 Maasai Morans as a backup to his own army. Like John Boyes, who chronicled his events through publishing a book, The King of Wakikuyu, Colonel Richard Menetsagen, in 1957, also wrote his book, The Kenyan Diary, 1902 to 1906, where he tells us, bro by bro, the events as they happened, how he killed these, he conquered these, how he splashed bullets to oblivious African people who died in those bush as they came out to see what was happening. The caravan moving from Muranga to Embu, the present-day Embu town, from Muranga town to Embu town. They came to see the European caravan with Morans, of course there were also Africans therein. They were sprayed with bullets, and this sadist, Colonel Richard Menzagen, was happy to see, and he would love like kind of Hitler in 1930s when he was doing his things there in 1930s. So by March 1904, Colonel Richard Manzagen had managed to conquer everybody on the way and clear them, kill them, destroy everyone, everything, animals, and even capture animals for the people. In that book, The Kenyan Diary, Colonel Manzagen boasts of his successful killings of about over 1,000 Africans, though these were doctored figures, as I said. Certainly, these were oblivious people who simply came out of the bushes where they were shepherding their flocks to observe the caravan from Foto to Embu, where they created a fort after 2 years of conquest. By 17th March 1904, the deal was done, and Colonel Manzagen was already in the present-day Embu town, and he had already hoisted the Union Jack flag, the flag of the British Empire. Oral sources have it that as the oblivious people came out from the bushes to view Colonel Manzagen's caravan, they would be sprayed with bullets which they initially referred to them as the raining maize, only to discover that it was not maize. These were not grains of maize, but which they later called deadly cereal that was injuring and killing some of them. After Manzagen left the central region of Kenya, following the capture of Embu on 17 March 1904, and having killed about 796 people from Dia Gishogo peoples, or the present-day Kirinyaga, and 250 from Embu Bere side, that is the present-day Embu County, he went on with his brutal expeditions. In this expedition, he traveled to Nandi, where he cunningly invited the leader of the Nandi rebellion against the coming Europeans. He therefore invited the king, the so-called Okoyot, Koitareo Arap Samoei, who was born in 1860 and died in 1905 after they met. Now, Okoyot Koitareo Arap Samoei was the supreme leader of the Nandi nation of Kenya. To negotiate, he invited him to negotiate a truce that never was. That was on 19th October 1905. But when the moment Okoyot Koitareo Arap Samoei came to negotiate peace, because Africans are peaceful people from their religiosity and spirituality, the Okoyot, or this leader, was surprised. People were surprised because Colonel Manzagen greeted him with bullets, pumping him with bullets across the chest. And he then quickly cut his hand. He cut the supreme leader of the Nandi nation. He cut his hand, the sadistic killing, and went with it. This hand was returned in Kenya 100 years later, in 2006, because he finally left Kenya with it in 1906 when he was finally deported by the colonial government. But they allowed him to go with the head, which was kept in a museum in UK, and the head was returned the other day when the opposition under President Mwai Kibaki took over and started liberal activities like unbanning Mau Mau, although they have not unbanned Muthirigo dance, which of 1930, which was very critical of the colonial system and the cultures of the African people. So that is the sadistic man, the killing of this man. Of course, Colonel Manzagen, after being deported in 1906 through Mombasa Port, where he left by the boat back to UK, he returned quietly in 1956, 11 years before he died. And that is the time he released his diary, which he had kept all those years, the so-called Kenya Diary. That reveals some of the chilling information. Some of it I've mentioned it here. Now, seen from these unfortunate backgrounds that confronted Gioko's childhood and youthful life, he was not able to trust the European missionary theologies that emphasized on unrealized eschatology or future heavenly hope and cooperation with the colonial state as a way of God. As a colonial administrator, Gioko, like other colonial appointees, had his duties that included collecting hard tax and poor tax, but was also instructed to aid the missionaries as they settled down in the colonial Kenya. Of course, he insisted you must buy. The community must accept you in order to buy their land. You would have even have wanted ritual acceptance. Of course, the European missionaries were not willing to do ritual acceptance. Of course, we shall see how one of them did ritual discourses and was accepted and born ritually into the community. In her book, By the Equator Snow Peak, Emily Crawford, wife to Dr. Crawford, the missionary medical doctor at Kigali, Embu, said the case of the erstwhile provincial commissioner of the Kenya province of the then British East Africa, referring to both Kenya and Uganda, which were British protectorates. By then, in 1912, Kenya was not a country but a province of one country called British East Africa. And the country had two provinces, Kenya province and Uganda province, and it was called British East Africa. So Emily Crawford quotes C.R.W. Lane, who was the provincial commissioner of Kenya province, who on 2nd December 1912 instructed chiefs to stop interfering with the work of the European missionaries. This letter was however drafted by Lane after some chiefs started fearing the missionary influence on their subjects. So some people started feeding the missionaries with their new medicine. They are taking power from us. And in that contestation, African chiefs had stopped their subject from consuming Western medicine and Western religion. They had trying to do that, Njega included. Emily Crawford, in that book, she also cites the case of Chief Goto wa Kibetu of the present-day Kirinyaga County, who was Njega wa Gioko's counterpart in the same Kirinyaga County. Of course, Njega was in the western Kirinyaga, the Ndia people, and the Wakibetu was on the eastern side, the Gioko subgroup was people of Kirinyaga County, who, despite being treated with the modern medicine twice by Dr. Crawford, her husband, still routed against CMS team after recovery. After recovery, Goto was a bit combative, more combative than even Njega. In fact, Gioko had to be retired through Reverend Crawford, brother to Dr. Crawford, who was stationed in Kabare Mission Center, as opposed to Kigali Mission Center, where Dr. Crawford was. It is around 1917 when they had a bad confrontation with this Reverend Canon Crawford in Kabare, when he came with his horse to disturb the people who were standing in the school that had been established. And at the end of it all, after a lot of confrontations, they asked the Crawford asked the colonial government to see to it that the man was sacked as a chief. So Goto may have died in 1927 or 10 years later after being sacked, not happy, because even his permanent building, the first person to build a permanent building in Kirinyaga, the present-day Kirinyaga, was demolished. And you can't see its trace in Kenya, where he had more of a major chiefdom that was elaborate. It doesn't exist, no trace of it there today. All these counties were served under the same colonial administrators. That is Muranga, Nyeri. They were all by then they were all served under Muranga. Muranga was more or less the regional headquarters. Hence, by 1908, when these Njega Goto would be converted into chiefs, they were taken there where they were coronated as chiefs in Muranga. Even those from Nyeri were brought there. So perhaps it is worthwhile to recall that Kirinyaga County, or Gioko's jurisdiction, neighbors Embu County on the eastern side and Muranga, Nyeri on the western side. All these counties were served under the same colonial administrators who appointed African chiefs such as Munyiri Wakanuku of Mavuri and Mbere, Kobwa Munyiri, son of Chief Munyiri Wakanuku of Mbere, Njega wa Gioko of Ndia Kirinyaga, Goto wa Kibetu of Gichogo Kirinyaga, Chief Mwandiko of Evurore Mbere, Kenani wa Murumbi of Evurore Mbere, Robia Wangodho of Dhawa Mbere, Manunga wa Ngosi of Dhawa Mbere, Njega wa Muthangato of Gandoli, Embu, Wango wa Makeri of Koimbe, Waithaga, Murang'a, Karoli of Wagakure of Waithaga, Murang'a, and Kinyanjui wa Gathirimu of Riruta, Kiambu County, among others. Of course, these were chiefs. Not all of them were served from Murang'a, because some, like Kinyanjui, were served from this other side of Kiambu, Fort Smith. Though originally from Keria in Kandara, Murang'a, Kinyanjui wa Nogo wa Gathirimu, born 1865, died 1929, was the first one to be appointed in Mount Kenya region as a chief following the brutal killing of the defiant Muthamaki Oyaki Wahinga in 1882. Gioko and Kibeto's defiance within Kirinyaga, the present-day Kirinyaga, against Western medicine, Western foods, and Western education, among other issues, is out of the painful encounters that inculcated mistrust in their dealings with all Europeans who largely looked the same. Such mistrusts went a notch higher when Harry Thuku, born 1895, died in 1970, and a leading nationalist who is comparable to South Africa's Obert Luturi, formed a political party, Young Kikuyu Association, in 1921. This act the colonial authorities, as the young Thuku followers, were causing trouble. It was decided that Thuku was to be drowned at Chania Falls, near Blue Post Hotel in Thika. And in this incident, all regional chiefs under Kinyanjui wa Gathirimu agreed with that suggestion. Paradoxically, Njega wa Gioko was the only chief who stubbornly refused to sign and thereby allow the colonial authorities to have their way out and eventually drown the pioneer Kenyan nationalist Harry Thuku to death. According to the Mau Mau General China, who wrote a book, of course his name is Waruhiu Itote, in 1979, the colonial government was annoyed that Thuku had sent a telegram to a senior British minister and exposed the difficulties that Africans were going through, and it included land expropriation and forced labor. For exposing the nakedness of the king, Thuku and his group were to be thrown in the rapids of the mighty River Chania. As noted in Waruhiu Itote's publications, the huge crowd gathered to listen to Chief Kinyanjui wa Gathirimu as he explained why Thuku, the rabble-rouser, and his team should be drowned via River Chania. Chief Njega wa Gioko of the present-day Kirinyaga County shot up in his usual commanding voice and said, "Nie Njega wa Gioko nindarega Thuku akue nĩũndũ wa kuga woni wake." That is, I, Njega, son of Gioko, I refuse to surrender Thuku to death for speaking his mind. Of course, after that, the crowd got worked up in support of this, a phenomenon that precipitated the meeting to die prematurely. So the meeting died. Such defiance was not simply a political protest, but a holistic rebuttal of all what colonialism and its religious inclinations stood for. Although Thuku was finally deported to Kismayu in the then British Somaliland, had not drowned to death via River Chania, Njega wa Gioko could not understand how the religious practice that was meant to replace his people's religion could be bribed to such bizarre forms of punishment. Put it differently, Gioko could have been wondering how church-state relationship meant. That is Calvinism. What is this Calvinism all about, which advocates the relationship between church and state as one and the same thing? In other words, are all decisions made by an established government sound. It is no wonder that, despite being a civil servant, Gioko associated himself with all other chiefs who were against European settlers. He also joined all the political associations that were formed by the emerging African nationalists since the First World War and the Second World War. Yes. This included the Young Kikuyu Association, 1921, the Kikuyu Central Association, 1925, and the more national party, the Kenya African Union, KAU, 1946. Of course, Njega died in 1948, so he didn't join Kenya African National Union, which was formed in 1960. He also took the KAU, Kenya African Union Oath of Obedience and Commitment to the freedom struggle, despite his position in government. One wonders what would have happened if Njega were alive in 1952, when the state of emergency was declared in 1952 by Sir Evelyn Baring. One wonders what would he have done? What would he have said? Of course, he would have ended up in colonial jails or killed that time. Now, wasn't it an extreme possession or a necessary risk? Wasn't he risking too much? He could be, as a chief, he required to toe the line, but he chose to balance between the people and the government. And the government was not willing or looked for a chance to kill him rather than sack him, because he was not so combative like Goto Akiveto, so directly. Of course, he would uproot the beacons they put when they were not there. Goto would do it directly as they were watching. So Njega would play some hide-and-seek game, and therefore he died a senior chief of the entire Embu district, which now has Kirinyaga and Embu County, and was deputized by Njagi wa Muthangato, then, who took over from him after he died in 1948. While it is easy to discuss the extremism of the evangelical European missionaries as they attempted to assert the superiority of Christianity, which was clothed in Western garments, it is equally imperative to underline the extremism of the African context as well. In the case of Njega wa Gioko, his unfortunate encounter with the early settlers and colonial functionaries could certainly have promoted a permanent mistrust. Nevertheless, his failure to listen and learn new things from these strange Caucasians can equally be seen as an extreme possession. In an interview with an eyewitness by name Mwalimu Alam Murage, the son of Hezekiah Ngige Ngari, the pioneer African medical practitioner in the old Embu district, which and particularly Njega wa Gioko's area, the researcher gathered the extremity of Gioko in diverse ways. First, Njega would mock every aspect that came with the evangelical missionaries, including the use of cups and plates, as he equated them with scores of dead people, the skulls of dead people, plates and cups. He could equate schoolgoers with lazy people and or parasites, as there were lots of farming and shepherding activities that he felt could be done instead. Before his Damascus-like conversion, where he finally embraced modernity, that is church and school, he could not even carry a handkerchief, as he wondered why a sane person could keep dirty mucus in his or her pockets, among other extremist positions. At a Nyeri meeting that was convened by the provincial commissioner, the PC, he rushed out at the European District Commissioner, DC, who told him that he should buy a handkerchief, as it is for several people like you. He rebuked the DC. Bwana, or sir, Bwana, sir, I cannot use a handkerchief like you. You whites are fools because you keep mucus inside your pockets for days and even months just as the way rats piss in one place. So he would tell the district commissioner, you are like rats because you keep mucus in your pocket. And yeah, those are some of the extremist positions that Njega was taking. The DC's provocation, anyway, came after he noted from a couple of meetings that Gioko was always walking out whenever he wanted to blow his nose. Hence the initial question, do you walk out just to blow your nose with your hands? Do you just walk out to blow your nose with your hands? By refusing dialogue, Gioko also behaved like the Calvinistic evangelical missionaries who were overly dismissive of African patterns of living and were downright dogmatic and rigid. Second, Gioko rejected Western education and religion, led Christianity with all his energy, and sometimes harassed those around him who pursued the Western route. Yet he ironically provided land for its progress. Third, he opposed the Western ways, yet he largely made use of it so as to remain at the top of things. For instance, he had a gun which he used for killing cattle so as to feed his ranch family of 8 wives and so many children, those scattered all over Dia, Mwea, some part of now we call Mbere South, which was part of his Mwea then. They were all over scattered. He also bought a car named Watuke in 1945, 2 years before he died, which was used. The car was called Watuke, and the car was used by his son Richard Njega after he abandoned his driver's job with East African Breweries Company. With this car, Richard Njega was shuttling people from the rural Kirinyaga to the capital city of Nairobi. He also used a stallion horse to crisscross his vast area that he superintended, which extended to some parts of the present-day Mukurweini, Nyeri. Actually, Muhito location was part of Njega's area. Of course, it was taken after Njega died, and also part of the so-called Embu County. Was the so-called Mwea in Embu County was part of Njega's area. That is Mbere South. With huge herds of sheep, goats, cattle, and servants, Njega Gioko comes out like a modern day capitalist or Western capitalist. Hence, his opposition to the Western science, Western education, Western religion did not fully match, because there are such contradictions that when you go beneath, you find that interrogation will show he also embraced a lot of Westernization. Even the way he was dressed heavily as more of a kings of the Middle East or the medieval ages. It is no wonder that a year before he died in 1947, he died in 1948, but a year before he died, that is 1947, he took all people by surprise when he went to a local Kiamudhambi Kanyekini church while holding a pen and a paper, and then went on to make a short speech thus: Niĩ Njega wa Gioko nĩndetĩkĩra karamu gatuĩke itimũ, nayo karatathi gatuĩke ngo. I want to say it in English. I, son of Gioko, have allowed my people to use a pen as a paper and a paper as a shield. In my view, it is after Gioko's pronouncement of 1947, akin to Abraham Lincoln's proclamation where slaves were freed in 1860, Emancipation Declaration in 1860, that Christianity and Western education gained broad acceptance among the people in Kirinyaga West, who were eagerly awaiting Wagioko's direction in religio-social matters. Certainly, the role of a leader in a communalistic society cannot be understated or underrated. And his voice was power. He was a king in every definition. In dress, his use of stallion horse, his wealth, he was like a small god. He was a small god, this so-called, he was a deity, not God as such, but he was an elevated person. And this compares with King Alfonso I, 1456 to 1543, of the Kingdom of Congo, whom the Portuguese converted to the Roman Catholic faith, only for the entire kingdom to confess the new faith. As noted in Gavogo 2020c, this was actualized shortly after, as the Congolese aristocracy leaders adopted Portuguese titles, coats of arms, dress styles, and their new names. Additionally, some middle-aged members of the kingdom were sent to Portugal to acquire the Western education. Further, the Congolese now observed Christian festivals, opened up churches, as craftsmen made Christian artifacts that were later found by missionaries of the 19th century. In finally appreciating the pen as the new spear and paper as the first-hand shield in the post-missionary world, Njega wa Gioko was finally able to lead the future rather than embracing denialism in his daily discourses. It may have been a belated move, but a necessary move, as it provided the way forward in a community where converting the king is tantamount to converting the whole kingdom. By delaying a lot in appreciating the power of the new normal, Njega wa Gioko failed to appreciate the rapid revolution that had swept the neighboring people, for example, the Madeira people of Nyeri County, in as early as 1908, when they took Western education and Christianity seriously under Reverend Watson, thereby earning a descriptive name, Madeira Magidhomo, or Madeira, the Western schooled people, and appreciated the unstoppable tempo of change that came with Westernization, in the way globalization is coming with that rapid tempo that is unstoppable. And so the people of Dia had the disadvantage because their king, I call him king, although there were no kingship, the man revered, whose word was law, whose voice reverberated across that area. And for rejecting Western education, the people of Dia were disadvantaged until 1948, when other people, the neighboring people, had taken Western education. The people of Kirinyaga West had that disadvantage. Today, however, Kirinyaga West, which is part of the old Dia, leads the country in KCP, Kenya Certificate of Primary Education. The students do very well. Without that voice of 1947 that Njega delivered, I personally believe the people will not have accepted education. Otherwise, only a few people who are seen like sellouts, collaborators, who are taking Western education. And so as society changed, the people of Dia were left behind. The two Dias now, one called Dia today, the other one Kirinyaga Central constituencies. They were left behind. As the neighbors progressed and progressed, Njega was still mocking the Westernization, the use of cups, plates in place of pots and other African garments. In view of this, Wagioko, like the Protestant missionary in his area, missed an opportunity by sticking to his extreme position against the gospel, against the Westernization, the Western education. Perhaps he could have encouraged the dialogue between Western education and African education. Perhaps he could have urged the dialogue between Christian religion and African religion, or any other religion for that matter. By rejecting dialogue on both sides of the divides, it denied the locals a chance to make broad comparisons in good time. It is no wonder that Njega's area had one of the highest levels of illiteracy in the central Kenya region by 1980s. And in the 21st century, however, the area had almost eclipsed other areas in the region and the country, as evidenced by the posting of the best results in the country during the Kenya Certificate of Primary Education annually. Now, the last section I want to address Njega wa Gioko's troubled ancestry. Was it troubled, or do people say he had a troubled ancestry, yet his background was fine? Was he a typically dear man, dear Kirinyaga person, or was he a Kamba Kirinyaga person? Did he have the Kamba blood? Did he have the Nyeri blood? A lot of stories have been doing rounds across the decades about that. Let us try to unveil that test. Njega wa Gioko's chronicler, a man who wrote his book about Njega in 1986, by name Councillor Joseph Karemi Karani. Councillor Joseph Karemi Karani, a civic reader, by then a good researcher. He claims that he had Kamba and Nyeri ancestries. He goes on to explain that Wagioko was born at Karema-Ka-Inya, the fourth hill in Udhaya, Karema-Ka-Inya, the fourth hill in Udhaya, Nyeri County, around 1865. His mother reportedly left Udhaya, Nyeri for Ndia Kirinyaga when he was barely 7 years old. He goes on to say that Wagioko's legitimate and all biological father, and whose actual name is unknown, died before he was mature enough to know him. Coming from a community that embraces communal spirituality, however, losing one's father at an early age does not mean automatic misery and or too much upbringing challenges, as the community was culturally bound to chip in or to come in and help such unfortunate people. Karani goes on to argue that his mother, Mishere, left Udhaya Nyeri in 1872 for Ndia Kirinyaga, and it is here where she sent off her widowhood and married Gioko, a person by name Gioko. Wagioko's mother was from the neighboring Kamba, according to this view, and went to Udhaya for unknown reasons. When Gioko was born, his mother first gave him a Kamba name, Gioko, which later changed to Gioko, after both mother and child underwent a cleansing ritual of acceptance. After these acceptance rituals at Udhaya Nyeri, Gioko and her mother were accepted in the local Angui clan, which they had now joined sometimes earlier. Karani goes on to explain that Gioko left Udhaya during his adulthood and moved to Ndia Kirinyaga and subsequently built a permanent home at Mukanduine village, Kanyekine ward. This is, however, problematic, as the argument that Gioko left Udhaya Nyeri in his adulthood is not convincing, as the chronicler also says that the 7-year-old boy and his mother Mishere left Udhaya Nyeri much earlier. Mishere's name was to change to Akabea as a result of her role in brewing marwa, a traditional liquor. For once the brew was ready, Mishere would generously serve it in a horn called Kabea, hence the nickname Wakabea. It means the one who uses the horn. In an interview with some members of the family, this Kamba or Udhaya Nyeri ancestry theory was flatly disputed and rejected flatly. Nobody wants to agree with that. There is nothing Nyeri, there is nothing Kamba in Njega wa Gioko, according to them. Joseph Karani's 1986 research on Njega wa Gioko, which culminated into a book, Njega wa Gioko, The Deer Plight, especially on the Udhaya, Nyeri, and Kamba ancestry, is disputed by a section of this family for They insist on paternal and maternal lineage having been from the present-day Kirinyaga County and not Nyeri or Othaya Nyeri or Cumberland of Eastern Kenya at all. In an interview on 23rd January 2019, they insisted that Maingi was the given name to the firstborn son of Gioko wa Maingi, a typically dear Kirinyaga child. As is the tradition among the local Kirinyaga people of central Kenya, the firstborn son is named after the paternal grandfather, hence Gioko wa Maingi. Gioko wa Maingi's firstborn son was named Maingi wa Gioko, as the people's religious cultures dictated so, and in order to keep up with the ancestral pantheons and their trajectories. Later on, and as noted above, he embraced the name Njega, meaning the good one, and dropped Maingi in 1901. He now became Njega wa Gioko, meaning Njega the son of Gioko. Regarding his mother, Misere or Wakavea, she was the daughter of Boy, and actually his only child. This again erases the Othaya Nyeri theory on her parentage. Wakavea came from area near Kutu's town of Kirinyaga County, actually Karia as we know it today, and the place is referred to as Getigeine near Karia Boys High School, 2 kilometers from Kilgoya town. Getigeine is geographically situated in the present-day Inoi South location of Kirinyaga Central. Njega wa Gioko himself was born at Mukanduine, Gitombe, in the present-day Kanyekine, one of Kirinyaga Central sub-county. His elder brother was called Ndano. It is widely thought he had sisters as well, who were not established in the course of this research. Wagioko's home, Mukanduine, was at the far end of Gitee Karura areas, and it was where his office and or working center was. Within the same compound, some of his wives lived in scattered houses or huts as a security detail. Informers, messengers, or Jamaya Sivu were also staying there. As a missionary sought Wagioko's permission to acquire land for missionary settlements, they had to visit this Mukaduini site, which now hosts Njega Secondary School. In turn, Gitee is where CMS Gitee Primary School was first built in 1930s and was later renamed AC Kanyekine Primary School. It was transferred in 1958 to where Njega's home had been and was renamed Njega Primary School in memory of this legendary chief. Njega Intermediate School also began in 1958 at the same spot where he had his chiefdom center. Further, CMS Karura Church was built in 1918 and is the present-day ACK St. Luke's Kiamudhambi Church. It was shifted from Karura area to Gitee area around 1923, and this was after the cultural nationalists or the locals in the area burnt it down in 1920 as a measure of protesting its presence, as they did not want a church or any other religion apart from their indigenous one. Was Wagioko the chief inciter? One wonders. Thus, they wanted to maintain their unadulterated African spirituality and its resultant rituals. Wagioko's office at Gitee Karura or Mukanduine near Kiamudhambi town was a beehive of activities as people across the region booked appointments so as to meet the Mudhamaki, turned chief, and who died as a senior chief of the entire Embu district. Embu district was created in 1933 to 1963, and Njega was automatically made the senior chief of the entire district, which now has Kirinyaga and Embu. Of course, in 1963, Kirinyaga was halved from Embu and it was created as a district on its own. But before Njega died, he was the chief of the entire 2 counties combined. And he was only deputized by Chief Njagi wa Muthangato of Ngandoli location, Embu. When he died in 1948, Chief Njagi wa Muthangato replaced him as the senior chief of Embu district, or Chief Kombo wa Munyiri of Mavuria location. Mbere now deputized the latter. The present Njega Secondary School is the actual spot, and it is where his well-marked grave lies since the code 9th July 1948 when he died. The last section about Njega wa Gioko is Njega and colonial authorities. When the colonialists came, they wanted to take some parts of the present-day Kirinyaga County. Gioko worked hard to stop colonial advance, and particularly the taking of land. Known for his strong stance and brevity in defending the Mwea, or Kirinyaga South, from European penetration, Gioko employed all tricks in the game to stop it. According to Muse Obert Kirigi and Dumo, in an interview, the colonial authorities were intent on converting the massive red soil Mwea into a sisal plantation. And as the Muzungu, or the Europeans, came placing beacons on the proposed area, Gioko, afraid of losing his pasture land for his massive flock, sent his men, or Jama, which stealthily followed the white man from behind, probably at night, and removed all the beacons. The Muzungu got frustrated and gave up, managing to utilize only a small portion on the eastern side that borders Embu County. Even this didn't suffice for long. Today, only the vegetable reminders of the sisal attest to Muzungu's endeavors. In all these discourses, geared towards protecting Mwea and the Kirinyaga people in general, Njega wa Gioko went through hard times, which were characterized by the following 3 setbacks. I explain. Number 1, he was once taken to Chania Falls near the present-day Blue Post Hotel, Thika Town. Here he was tortured and was expected to announce that Mwea belongs to the European settlers. Failure to do so meant that he was to be drowned through the mighty river Chania. Surprisingly, Njega stood his guns. For him, it was no retreat, no surrender. Instead, he announced, Mwea Newandia, or Mwea belongs to the local people of the present-day Kirinyaga County of Kenya. Number 2, in secret, the Europeans later subdivided Mwea, put a boundary post, and then went for Njega wa Gioko at his Mokadwini Kiamudhambe base. They implored upon him to accompany them to Mwea, that is Kirinyaga South, to see the demarcating beacons that they had erected. They wanted Gioko to sign that he had consented to the new arrangement. Upon arrival in Mwea public gathering, Gioko spoke in the local dialect and didn't allow any translation. Conversely, Gioko mobilized the people to uproot the beacons that had been erected in Mwea. This annoyed the colonial administrators and settlers. They refused to take him back home and left him in the then bushy parts of Mwea, now Anguru town, and its environs. The aim was to see him mauled to death by the wild animals that were common in those bushes then. Surprisingly, he made it and returned to his Mokadwine home near Kiamudhambe town. The third one, in 1933, Chief Kombo wa Munyiri of Mavuria location of Bereland in the present-day Bere South constituency announced that henceforth Mwea would be part of his Mavuria location. It is important to note that Bereland of the present-day Embu County had 3 ranch locations following the establishment of colonial government in Kenya. That is Dawa location, Siakago areas, under Chief Rumbi wa Ngodho, Mavuria under Kombo wa Munyiri, and Ivurore location under Kenani wa Murumbi. In the case of Mavuria location, it stretches from Mwea Kirinyaga border, Gachoka, and Kiambere. When Chief Kombo wa Munyiri announced that all Mwea stands under his jurisdiction, Gioko swiftly moved to the colonial court, where he won the case in Embu, and even after an appeal in Nairobi, Gioko still won the case. But of course, the colonial government went on to divide Mwea into two, as it is today. It is from there that songs were composed in his praise. Nonetheless, Mwea was still subdivided into two as the colonial authorities employed some Solomonic wisdom that Solomon himself failed to apply, and divided Mwea as we see it today. They used Solomonic wisdom of subdividing a child, and Solomon himself did not cut the child into two pieces. So Mwea in 1933 was cut into two, and the cutting went straight up to River Kie, that other side of Gichogo, and that's the way it is today, where Dia and Gichogo, Mwea were placed along one line that stands today. After the declaration of the state of emergency by the then governor of colonial Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring, in 1952, the Shine governor, who had no mercy for Mau Mau freedom fighters, Njega Wagioko's house was scattered up. Some members of Wagioko's family were taken in diverse colonial detention camps, put in the new villagization that came with the crackdown of Mau Mau uprising and so on. To date, lots of charges has faced the Kingsley family, including, ironically, destitution. In other words, the family has even some destitutes, people who are even homeless, yet they owned the world. Today, even more, they are nowhere. They are put in a manner that is really food for thought. To this end, Njega Gioko could not understand the importance of the evangelical missionary theologies that could condone the torture and harassment that he went through as a British imperialist. Yet he was still working for them as their senior chief of the entire Embu district. It is no wonder that this suspicion and mistrust saw him reluctantly accept the missionary education and religion only in 1947, a year before he kicked the bucket. Without structured dialogue, Wagioko, as with the rest of the African populace, felt that Gotire, Mudongo, na Mubea, that there is no marked difference. There was no marked difference between the missionary and the colonial settler and administrator. Hence, the suspicion and mistrust remained all through till he died, till he breathed his last. Certainly, dialogue is critical in any human endeavor. In conclusion, this presentation set out to explore the way Chief Njega Wagioko related with the 20th century European missionaries who entered his Kirinyaga West area from 1907 to 1908, particularly the evangelical Protestant missionaries, the Church Missionary Society, with evangelicals employing the doctrinary stringent theology of John Calvin as their modus operandi. How did they play out their theologies on church-state relations? Certainly, they consulted Wagioko as they sought to build a mission center at Githuguya, Sagana. Okay, we have now Sagana Technical there, way back in 1907. Their unapologetic working and appreciation of the colonial government was within their Calvinistic theology, which drove them to see church-state relation as the way of God. As a custodian of idiomoral contents of the people, Wagioko embraced spirituality that permeated all pillars of culture. Of course, we refer to kinship, ethics, politics, economics, aesthetics, and ethics, where every lifetime step was ideally a religious duty. Such holistic approaches were dismissed by the evangelicals as irreligious, and the African god was seen as Deus remotus or Deus absconditus. Deus absconditus, that's Latin for a withdrawn god. Deus remotus or Deus absconditus, a withdrawn god who needed to be removed from the African mind. Hence, all rituals, according to missionaries, were bad. In this encounter, interfaith dialogue was the single most item that was lacking, as the duo took extremist possession. As a result, there were casualties on both sides of the divide. That is, Wagioko and African religio-culture versus Westernization and Christianity on the other hand. As the positive aspect of European science took longer before it was fully actualized in Wagioko's Kirinyagas jurisdiction, okay, the western part in particular. As the locals burnt down CMS Karura Church, today Centruku Kiamodhambe, in 1920, a church which was built in 1919, open conflict between African religion and Christianity that was introduced in Western evangelical attire had begun in earnest. As both sides of the divide took radical positions, the holistic growth of the society was slowed down, and indeed we paid heavily for this contestation between the Njega team versus the missionary team. The people suffered greatly, and that contestation, that imprint continues to follow us like a shadow. Certainly, dialogue is always the solution to any human conflict, any human disagreement. It is dialogue that is able to stop challenges facing people in the vicissitudes of life. Thank you very much.